Did you know the one man Hitler feared most was a poetry-writing, reincarnated American general with pearl-handled pistols? He was George S. Patton, a general so unique that it felt like he belonged to another era. And the Nazis? They absolutely dreaded him. December 1944. General George S. Patton and his Third Army taught Adolf Hitler a lesson he'd never forget. As the Allies stormed through Europe, Patton's crazy-fast dash across France showed Hitler what the American army was really made of. During the freezing Battle of the Bulge, when everyone thought the Allies were done for, Patton pulled off an impossible move that completely flipped the war around. It was the moment Hitler realized, you just don't mess with Patton and the Third Army. Blood and guts, forging a warrior. George S. Patton Jr. wasn't made into a warrior by fighting. He was a warrior convinced he was born only to wage war. Even as a kid from a rich California family, his life was full of shocking opposites. He was an aristocrat, descended from a long line of Confederate war heroes and colonial governors who privately struggled with dyslexia, finding it difficult to read and write. Yet he became one of the most widely read and historically knowledgeable officers in the entire U.S. Army. He was a devout Episcopalian who prayed daily, yet he swore with a creativity and ferocity that could make a seasoned drill sergeant blush. Deep down, Patton was convinced fate had a plan for him because he truly believed in reincarnation. This wasn't some fleeting idea. It was the core of who he was. He was positive he'd lived many lives, marching with Roman legions, riding with Napoleon's cavalry, fighting countless wars. To him, he wasn't just Patton, he was an ancient warrior spirit brought back again. This wild belief gave him an unbreakable feeling of destiny, like he was born to command in battle. He didn't just study history, he believed he was a part of its eternal, violent rhythm. His huge personality was built carefully, piece by piece, as a tool for leadership. Early on, Patton realized that in the brutal, chaotic mess of battle, a general couldn't just give orders. He had to be a living representation of war itself. And so, he built one from the ground up. He had his uniforms custom-tailored for a more imposing fit. He wore highly polished, knee-high cavalry boots and a gleaming, modified helmet, even when trudging through the mud and filth of the front lines. Most famously, he strapped on not one, but two iconic sidearms. On his right hip, a Colt single-action Army .45, the classic peacemaker of the Old West. On his left, a powerful Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum. Both were fitted with distinctive ivory grips. They were props in the grand drama of leadership. He also cultivated a stern, intimidating scowl he privately called his war face. His command jeep was a rolling statement of his authority. It bore oversized 3-star rank placards on the front and back, and it was equipped with a deafeningly loud klaxon horn that announces his impending arrival and strikes fear and anticipation into the hearts of both his own men and the enemy. For Patton, leadership was a performance, and he was its greatest actor. He was transforming himself into the living embodiment of the American fighting spirit. Aggressive, uncompromising, flamboyant, and terrifyingly confident. But a commanding image is nothing without a voice to match. How did he forge an army in his own image with nothing but words? The real secret to Patton's legend was the way he turned thousands of regular American draftees into Europe's scariest fighting force, with his amazing, almost hypnotic way of connecting with his soldiers and firing them up. This power was never more evident than on June 5th, 1944, the day before the Allied invasion of Normandy. His new command, the U.S. Third Army, was massed in England, and Patton delivered a series of speeches to his men that have since become the stuff of military legend. These weren't your typical smooth, patriotic speeches from some general stuck behind a desk. This was Patton, raw, unfiltered, speaking the brutal, profane, and direct language of the common soldier. Standing before thousands of young men, many of whom were just weeks away from their first taste of combat, he never used a single note. His voice, which was often described as surprisingly high-pitched in private conversation, became a clear, resonant, and commanding force over the loudspeakers. "Men," he began with his voice cutting through the tense silence. "This stuff that some sources sling around about America wanting out of this war, not wanting to fight, is a crock of bullshit. Americans love to fight traditionally. All real Americans love the sting and clash of battle." He immediately tapped into the deepest veins of the American psyche, a love of competition and an abhorrence of failure. "Americans love a winner," he declared. "Americans will not tolerate a loser. Americans despise cowards. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost nor will ever lose a war, for the very idea of losing is hateful to an American." He was brutally and refreshingly honest about the reality of fear. Yes, every man is scared in his first battle. If he says he's not, he's a liar, he admitted, instantly earning the trust of his men. But the real hero is the man who fights even though he is scared. He then masterfully turned that internal fear outward, transforming it into a weapon of pure aggression. He explained that all the endless, mind-numbing, chicken shit drilling they had endured had a single vital purpose: alertness. "If you're not alert," he roared, "sometime a German son of an asshole bitch is going to sneak up behind you and beat you to death with a sock full of shit." The thousands of assembled soldiers erupted in a massive roar of laughter and agreement. He was speaking their language. He had their undivided attention. The speech was a masterclass in battlefield psychology. He systematically dehumanized the enemy, stripping them of their humanity and turning them into objects of contempt that must be destroyed. "We're not going to just shoot the sons of bitches," he thundered. "We're going to rip out their living goddamn guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun cocksuckers by the bushel fucking basket." He defined war in its most primal terms. War is a bloody killing business. You've got to spill their blood or they will spill yours. And finally, he gave them a reason to endure it all, a promise of a legacy, a story they could tell for the rest of their lives that set them apart from all other men. 20 years from now, when you are sitting by the fireplace with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you what you did in the Great World War II, he promised, you won't have to cough, shift him to the other knee and say, "Well, your granddaddy shoveled shit in Louisiana." No, sir, you can look him straight in the eye and say, "Son, your granddaddy rode with the Great Third Army and a son of a goddamn bitch named Georgie Patton." He knew exactly what he was doing. As he once explained, you can't run an army without profanity, and it has to be eloquent profanity. It was eloquent, it was brutal, it was inspiring, and it was exactly what those men needed to hear. The speech acted like a psychological forge, burning away their fear and tempering their spirits into the disciplined, aggressive, and unstoppable fighting force that tore a bloody path across the heart of Nazi Germany. The slapping incidents in the professional wilderness. With such a powerful, almost fatherly connection to his men, how did Patton commit an act that would betray their trust and nearly end his career in total disgrace? Let's head back to Sicily in the scorching summer of 1943. Patton, leading the U.S. 7th Army, had just pulled off an incredibly daring and clever campaign. Ignoring the cautious plans of his superiors, he had launched his armored forces on a lightning-fast 100-mile dash in just 72 hours to capture the key city of Palermo. He then drove relentlessly east, beating his perpetually cautious British rival, General Bernard Montgomery, to the strategic prize of Messina. It was a stunning victory and a textbook example of the kind of high-speed, aggressive warfare that Patton loved. But it was a brutal campaign, and lots of American soldiers died. Everyone was completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. That's when Patton's famous temper, the fire that usually made him so brilliant in battle, completely blew up and ruined everything. On August 3, 1943, Patton decided to visit the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia to see the wounded men of his army personally. As he walked through the tents, offering words of encouragement, He came across Private Charles H. Cool, who was sitting slumped on a stool, seemingly uninjured. When Patton asked the private what was wrong with him, Cool, who was suffering from a high fever and dysentery, replied, "It's my nerves. I guess I can't take the shelling." The soldier had no visible wounds. He was suffering from what was then crudely and dismissively called battle fatigue or shell shock, which is now widely referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But to George Patton, a guy who believed in an ancient warrior code, who thought you had to conquer fear with pure willpower, it was just plain cowardice. He exploded in a fit of uncontrollable rage. In front of a tent full of horrified doctors, nurses, and genuinely wounded soldiers, he called Private Cool a goddamn coward. He screamed, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself." And then, with his gloved hand, he slapped the private across the face. He grabbed Cool by the collar and physically dragged him to the entrance of the tent, literally kicking him out and screaming for him to be sent back to the front lines immediately. It was a shocking abuse of his command. Incredibly, just 1 week later, on August 10th, he did it again. At another hospital, he encountered Private Paul G. Bennett, who was suffering from a high fever and severe dehydration, but also admitted to being terrified of the constant heavy gunfire. Patton, seeing only the soldier's fear, lost control once more. "It's your nerves," he roared with his voice filled with contempt. "You're just a goddamn coward." He then slapped Bennett hard across the head, knocking the liner from his helmet, and threatened to have him shot for his cowardice. In the midst of a brutal war, how could two slaps, delivered in the heat of the moment, ignite a national firestorm and bring down America's greatest general? News of the two incidents, initially whispered in shock among the medical corps, spread like wildfire up the chain of command. It soon landed on the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike, a man known for his calm and steady demeanor, was privately furious. He understood Patton's immense value as a combat commander, a guarantor of our victory, but he also knew that such behavior was an unforgivable breach of leadership. It was a betrayal of the sacred trust between a commander and his men, especially the sick and the wounded. He immediately sent Patton a scathing private letter, a masterpiece of controlled fury. "I am well aware of the necessity for hardness and toughness on the battlefield," Eisenhower wrote. "I am not talking about that. I am talking about the unnecessary brutality to the sick and injured, which is prescribed by military custom and orders." Eisenhower gave him an ultimatum. Patton had to apologize, not just to the two privates he hit, but to all the doctors and nurses who saw it, and basically to every single soldier in the 7th Army. For a proud man like Patton, it was incredibly humiliating. But with his career on the line, he had no other option. For a time, it seemed that Eisenhower's decisive action had contained the crisis. Recognizing Patton's almost irreplaceable value to the war effort, he suppressed the story, issuing strict orders to keep it from reaching the press. But in a war with thousands of reporters roaming the theater, secrets have a way of getting out. In November 1943, the famous muckraking journalist Drew Pearson got a tip about the incidents. He broke the story on his nationally syndicated radio program, and the scandal exploded onto the front pages of newspapers across the United States. The public reaction was immediate and ferocious. Members of Congress stood on the floor of the House and demanded Patton's immediate dismissal. Newspapers ran scathing editorials calling for him to be court-martialed. Even Patton's old mentor and patron, the legendary General of the Armies, John J. Pershing, privately condemned his actions. Patton's brilliant military career, which had seemed destined for the highest echelons of command, was now hanging by a thread. He was quietly relieved of command of the 7th Army. The decision had already been made in the halls of power that his more cautious and reliable former subordinate, General Omar Bradley, would be given command of the American ground forces for the upcoming invasion of Europe. The slapping incident simply served as the final public justification. For the next 11 long months, Patton was a general without an army, relegated to a professional wilderness. He was America's greatest fighting general, a tactical genius without peer, and now on the eve of the most important and decisive battle of the entire war, he had been put on ice. The Ghost Army, Patton the Phantom Menace. What do you do with your most brilliant, most aggressive, and now most controversial general? In the early months of 1944, as the Allies were secretly massing the largest invasion force in human history in the south of England, the High Command had a serious Patton problem. They had a tactical genius, a master of armored warfare, sitting on the sidelines, tarnished by scandal. But Allied intelligence, especially the brilliant deception experts in Britain's MI5, figured out something clever. Patton's massive reputation, his bigger-than-life image, and the pure dread he put into the enemy could actually be used as a super powerful weapon. And this realization all came down to one critical, undisputed fact. The German High Command was utterly obsessed with George S. Patton. More than any other Allied general, more than Eisenhower, more than Montgomery, more than Bradley, Patton was the one they genuinely respected and feared. German intelligence had studied his fast blitzkrieg tactics in North Africa and Sicily inside and out. They didn't see him as some slow, by-the-book American general. No, they saw a kindred spirit, a panzer general who fought just like their own best. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, famously called him the American Guderian, comparing him to the father of the Blitzkrieg. Even the legendary Erwin Rommel, after being outmaneuvered by Patton, credited him with executing the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare. The Germans were absolutely convinced of one thing. Wherever the main Allied invasion of Europe came, wherever the decisive blow would fall, George S. Patton would be the one leading it. The Allied planners decided to use this German obsession, this hero worship of their most dangerous enemy, against them. This decision gave birth to one of the most elaborate, imaginative, and stunningly successful deception campaigns in the history of warfare, Operation Fortitude. The primary goal of Fortitude was to convince the Germans that the main Allied landing would not come at the beaches of Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Calais was the most logical target, offering the shortest sea route and the most direct path to Germany. To make this threat credible, the Allies needed to create the illusion of a massive army group, over 1 million men strong, massing in the fields and harbors of southeast England, poised to strike directly at Calais. This fake army got an official name, the First U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, and it needed a general, someone so famous, so aggressive, and so feared that the Germans would have to believe he was leading the main Allied attack. There was only one guy for the job, General George S. Patton. How do you build an entire army out of thin air? And more importantly, how do you make your enemy believe that it's real? While Patton was officially and secretly given command of the very real U.S. Third Army, which was training in another part of England, his primary top secret and highly visible mission was to be the commander of a ghost army. FUSAG was a totally fake army, a brilliant military theater trick designed to fool German spy planes, listening posts, and their entire intelligence network. Across the green fields of East Anglia and southeast England, a massive phantom force began to materialize as if from nowhere. Special units from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unique unit composed of artists, sound engineers, and designers who came to be known as the Ghost Army, deployed hundreds of inflatable, full-scale rubber Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and transport trucks. From 30,000 feet, where German reconnaissance planes flew, these decoys were visually indistinguishable from the real thing. To create the illusion of constant movement and activity, a handful of soldiers would drive a single real tank in circles, using specially designed rolling tools to create the tread marks of an entire armored column in the soft earth. Fake airfields were hastily constructed, populated with dummy plywood aircraft. In the harbors of Dover and the surrounding ports, A fleet of fake landing craft, ingeniously made of canvas and scaffolding, stretched over empty oil drums, was moored to create the undeniable impression of an imminent, massive assault. What you heard was just as important as what you saw. The Ghost Army had these massive speakers on trucks, some heard from 15 miles away, blasting recordings of a million-man army. They had a carefully put-together collection of sounds: tanks clanking, trucks rumbling, construction happening, troops shouting, playing on repeat for German listening posts across the channel to pick up. An equally massive and complex web of fake radio traffic was created. A team of skilled radio operators working from an 8-inch thick book of scripted messages sent out thousands of coded transmissions between fictitious headquarters, perfectly mimicking the daily administrative and operational chatter of a real army preparing for a massive invasion. The final and perhaps most crucial layer of the deception came from human intelligence. The British double-cross system, run by the XX Committee, had unbelievably managed to capture or turn almost every single German spy in the UK. These double agents, most brilliantly a charismatic Catalan spy named Juan Pujol, who was given the code name Garbo by the British, began feeding a steady and convincing stream of highly detailed reports to their German handlers in Berlin. Garbo, who had created an entire imaginary spy network of 14 fictitious sub-agents, was so effective and so trusted that Adolf Hitler himself reportedly took a personal interest in his intelligence reports. Garbo and his colleagues painted a vivid, detailed, and utterly false picture of a massive force, which they claimed was 70% larger than the actual Allied army, preparing to strike at the Pas de Calais under the personal command of the Allies' greatest general. Patton, for his part, played the role of the Phantom Commander to perfection. He was made highly visible. He ostentatiously reviewed his fake divisions, gave speeches to non-existent troops, and made a point of dining with officials and being seen in public in London and Dover, all the while knowing that German intelligence would be tracking his every move. The entire elaborate ruse worked better than anyone at Allied headquarters could have possibly dreamed. Utterly convinced that Patton and his Phantom Army at Calais represented the real and primary threat, Hitler kept his most powerful and experienced divisions, the entire German 15th Army, anchored at the Pas de Calais, waiting for an invasion that never came. When the real D-Day landings began on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the German High Command was certain it was a diversion, a feint designed to draw their reserves away from Calais. For several critical weeks after the landing, as the brutal and decisive battle for Normandy raged, Hitler refused to release the 15th Army. The Ghost Army, commanded by a general in disgrace, had successfully pinned down hundreds of thousands of enemy troops and scores of panzer tanks, winning the most important strategic battle of D-Day without firing a single shot. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last, desperate gamble. Having successfully fooled the Germans and enabled the D-Day landings, how did Patton then proceed to break them on the field of battle? 1 month after D-Day, with the Allied beachhead in Normandy secure, George Patton was finally unleashed. He was secretly flown to France, and on August 1, 1944, his very real U.S. Third Army became operational. What followed was one of the most breathtaking and rapid advances in the history of modern warfare. While other Allied armies found themselves bogged down in the brutal, close-quarters fighting of the dense Normandy hedgerow country, Patton's Third Army broke out of the pocket and executed a massive, sweeping, flanking maneuver. His armored columns, operating with a speed and aggression that stunned both friend and foe, raced across the breadth of France. They bypassed heavily defended strongpoints, encircled entire German units, and liberated a string of cities and towns, including Orléans, Rheims, and Chalon. It was the kind of warfare Patton had been born for, a pure war of movement, speed, and relentless, unapologetic aggression. His philosophy was simple and brutal: always take the offensive, never dig in. By late 1944, his Third Army had pushed all the way to the German border in the province of Lorraine, and it seemed as though nothing could stop their drive into the heart of the Reich. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the war was about to take a sudden, terrifying, and unexpected turn. In a final, desperate gamble, Adolf Hitler, against the advice of many of his own generals, launched a massive surprise offensive. He thought the Western Allies were weak and that one big, crushing defeat would break them apart, forcing them to make peace. That way, he could throw all his remaining troops at the Soviet Union. His plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was a genius move of pure surprise. In total secrecy, Hitler had rounded up Germany's absolute last reserves. He drained other fronts, brought back elite SS Panzer divisions, and gave them Germany's latest, scariest tanks, like the huge 70-ton King Tiger. He pointed this armored punch right at the weakest spot in the American line, the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. It was a sparsely populated, heavily wooded region, considered a quiet sector by the Allies, and a place to rest veteran units and give new, inexperienced divisions their first taste of the front lines. It was the last place anyone expected a major attack, and that was precisely what Hitler was counting on. To succeed, his plan required two critical elements: absolute surprise and terrible weather. The surprise would be achieved by maintaining complete radio silence and moving his armies, nearly 500,000 men and over 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles, into their final attack positions only under the cover of darkness. The weather was even more crucial. Hitler deliberately timed his offensive for a period of deep winter, knowing that thick fog, low clouds, and heavy snow would ground the Allies' single greatest military advantage: their overwhelming air superiority. Without American and British fighter bombers to attack his armored columns, Hitler's panzers could advance unimpeded, just as they had in the glory days of 1940. On the morning of December 16, 1944, both of Hitler's conditions were met. Under a thick shroud of snow and freezing fog, a massive German artillery barrage erupted, tearing the morning silence to shreds. An immense force of 29 divisions smashed into the unsuspecting and thinly spread American lines. The attack hit like a hammer. Fresh American units, like the 106th Infantry, barely in the fight for days, were crushed. In the first few hours, thousands died, and thousands more were captured in one of the biggest surrenders in U.S. history. The German push blew a huge hole, a bulge in the American front that just got bigger and scarier every hour. Panic and confusion rippled through the American command structure. It was a complete and utter intelligence failure, a strategic surprise on a scale not seen since Pearl Harbor. At the very center of this swirling chaos was the vital Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne. All the major roads in the mountainous Ardennes region converged there, making it the absolute key to the German advance. If the Germans could capture Bastogne, their panzer divisions would have a clear, paved route to their next objective, the Meuse River. Rushed into the town just hours ahead of the German spearheads were the battle-hardened but lightly equipped paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. With little ammunition, inadequate winter clothing, no heavy artillery, and no hope of air support, they were quickly surrounded and besieged by a vastly superior German force. Their situation was desperate. To the shocked Allied High Command, it looked very much like Hitler's last great gamble might just pay off. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the Allies were losing badly. The scale of the initial German success was so profound and so shocking that it sent waves of panic through the highest levels of the Allied command. The Germans had achieved a level of strategic surprise that was almost unthinkable at this late stage of the war. For a few critical, terrifying days, many senior Allied generals, including several on Eisenhower's own staff at SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Forces, Expeditionary Force, genuinely believed that the German offensive could succeed. They openly feared a second Dunkirk, a catastrophic defeat that could unravel the entire Western Front, destroy dozens of American divisions, and potentially change the outcome of the war. They needed a miracle, but the one man in their arsenal who specialized in battlefield miracles was 100 miles to the south, mired in his own brutal battle and still living in the long shadow of his public disgrace. The Verdun Conference and the impossible 90-degree turn. On the morning of December 19, 1944, as the German offensive plunged even deeper into the Ardennes, a grim-faced Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting of his senior commanders. They gathered in a damp, cold, and poorly lit headquarters bunker in the historic French fortress city of Verdun. Everyone was in a deep panic, barely holding it in. The generals there, Omar Bradley, the American ground forces boss, Jacob Devers, and their teams, looked tired and grim, staring at maps that showed things getting worse by the minute. Their armies were being pushed back, entire divisions were being cut off, communications were in chaos, and a major strategic defeat seemed not just possible, but frighteningly likely. Into this atmosphere of oppressive gloom and despair strode General George S. Patton. While the other commanders were dressed in standard, mud-stained combat fatigues, Patton made an entrance. He was impeccably dressed in his custom-tailored uniform, with his cavalry boots polished to a mirror shine, and his famous ivory-handled pistols resting confidently at his hips. His demeanor was not one of worry or despair, but of a barely concealed, almost joyful excitement. He looked at the map not with fear, but with the predatory gaze of a master chess player who sees an opponent's fatal blunder. To Patton, the Germans hadn't broken through the American lines. They had foolishly and arrogantly stuck their head into a noose, and he was about to pull it tight. The other commanders quickly noticed the stark contrast in attitude. While they spoke of holding defensive lines, of containing the German advance, and of a strategic withdrawal, Patton was thinking only of attack, of counterattack, and of annihilation. He had already guessed the purpose of the meeting, and on the long, tense drive to Verdun, he had ordered his staff to begin drawing up 3 separate, detailed contingency plans. These were not vague ideas scribbled on a notepad. They were fully fledged operational orders for disengaging major elements of his Third Army from their current bloody battle in the Saar region, pivoting the entire force a full 90 degrees to the north, and launching a massive coordinated counterattack into the exposed southern flank of the German Bulge. Inside the smoky conference room, Eisenhower calmly laid out the desperate situation, focusing on the plight of the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. He then turned to his assembled commanders and asked what they could do. After a moment of heavy silence, he looked directly at Patton. "George," he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment, "how long would it take you to disengage and start a counterattack north with at least 3 divisions?" Patton, who had been waiting for this exact question, for this exact moment his entire life, looked Eisenhower straight in the eye and delivered one of the most famous, confident, and audacious lines of the war. "As soon as you're through with me," he replied calmly. The room was stunned into silence. Eisenhower, a man who prized careful planning and realistic timetables, thought Patton was being flippant. "Don't be fatuous, George," he warned. He knew, as every man in that room knew, the monumental logistical complexity of what he was asking. Disengaging 3 full divisions, tens of thousands of men, and thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces from active frontline combat, rerouting them over 100 miles of frozen, snow-choked roads in the middle of a historic blizzard, and then launching a coordinated attack was a task that should, by any conventional military calculation, take at least a week and probably longer. It was, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Patton simply clarified his position. He wasn't being fatuous. He wasn't guessing. He could start a limited, probing attack within 24 hours, and he could hit the Germans with the full force of 3 divisions in exactly 48 hours. "This is no guess," he insisted with his voice hard as iron, explaining that his staff had already worked out the operational orders, the routes, and the timetables. Still doubtful, but with no other real choices, Eisenhower gave him the green light. "Okay, George," he said, "get started." Patton stood up, strode briskly out of the conference room, found a secure phone line to his headquarters, and uttered a simple, two-word code phrase that he had prearranged with his staff, a phrase that set in motion one of the greatest military maneuvers in American history: play ball. Patton's supreme confidence at the Verdun Conference wasn't just a display of arrogance. It was the product of relentless preparation and an almost supernatural, instinctive feel for the rhythm of the battlefield. While other Allied commands were enjoying the supposed quiet of the Ardennes sector in early December, Patton had been uneasy. His G2 intelligence section, led by the brilliant Colonel Oscar Koch, had noted a significant German troop and armor buildup in the region. While they, like every other Allied intelligence unit, catastrophically misinterpreted its scale and intent, Patton felt instinctively that something was coming. It was because of this gnawing feeling, this warrior's intuition, that he had already ordered his staff to secretly war game the exact scenario of a rapid emergency pivot to the north. When Eisenhower asked him to do the impossible, Patton wasn't boasting or guessing. He was activating a detailed plan that already existed. He wasn't just reacting to the battle. He had already started fighting it in his mind days before it even began. The Great Pivot and the Patton Weather, a logistical and spiritual miracle. With the order given, how do you actually move an entire army in the middle of a blizzard faster than anyone in history had ever done before? The simple code phrase, play ball, unleashed what is widely considered to be one of the greatest and most audacious logistical feats in the history of modern warfare. The task facing Patton's Third Army was nothing short of Herculean, a challenge of organization, will, and endurance that would have broken a lesser command. It required the immediate disengagement and movement of three full divisions: the 4th Armored, the 81st Infantry, and the 26th Infantry, with 3 more to follow in the coming days. In total, this amounted to nearly 250,000 men and over 133,000 vehicles, a massive, mechanized organism of Sherman tanks, M10 tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery pieces, 2.5-ton supply trucks, and quarter-ton jeeps. And they had to accomplish this monumental pivot in the middle of one of the worst and coldest European winters on record. The conditions on the ground were nothing short of apocalyptic. A severe blizzard had covered the entire region in a thick, heavy layer of snow, with deep drifts making many secondary roads impassable. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing and stayed there, turning the roads into treacherous sheets of black ice. A thick, freezing fog descended upon the landscape, reducing visibility at times to just a few yards. The cold was a weapon in itself. The oil and lubricants in vehicle engines had to be prevented from freezing solid, and this required starting every single engine every half hour around the clock. Frostbite was as great an enemy to the soldiers as the Germans, with thousands of men suffering from debilitating cold weather injuries. It was in this frozen white hellscape that the Third Army began its great pivot to the north. The unsung architect of this miracle was not just Patton, but his brilliant and relentlessly efficient G4 logistics chief, Colonel Walter J. Muller. Muller had long drilled the Third Army's supply echelons in the core principles of flexibility, improvisation, and above all, speed. While other armies of the era often relied on static, rear area supply depots, which created a long and vulnerable logistical tail, Muller's units were masters of a Red Ball Express style of continuous movement. They created rolling supply dumps that moved in tandem with the forward combat units, allowing them to rapidly exploit breakthroughs without waiting for supplies to catch up. Now, this revolutionary logistical training would be put to the ultimate history-making test. A vast and complex traffic control plan was instantly put into effect. Military police were dispatched to every major crossroads with their white helmets and gloves barely visible in the swirling snow to act as human traffic signals, untangling the colossal columns and directing them onto their new northbound routes. Army engineers worked around the clock, often under the threat of German air attack, spreading salt and sand on the iciest stretches of road and hastily repairing bridges. Maintenance crews, with their hands numb with cold, performed mechanical miracles, keeping the vast fleet of vehicles running in the brutal, sub-zero temperatures. The movement was a relentless, 24-hour-a-day operation. The roads of eastern France became a solid, unending river of steel, grinding its way north. The entire operation consumed a staggering 1 million gallons of gasoline per day. In just the first few days of the pivot, the Third Army's support echelons moved over 62,000 tons of supplies, ammunition, food, medical equipment, and fuel to support the new unplanned offensive. And at the heart of it all was Patton, a whirlwind of motion and indomitable will. He was everywhere at once, driving up and down the icy roads in his open command jeep with his face raw from the wind. He roared encouragement at the frozen, exhausted truck drivers, mercilessly berated any officer who showed the slightest sign of hesitation or slowing down, and projected an aura of absolute, unwavering confidence that seemed to radiate out and warm the men around him. He knew that this was a battle of will and morale as much as it was a battle of logistics and steel. As the day of the planned attack, the December 22nd, neared, the weather remained abysmal, threatening to deny Patton the close air support from the 9th Air Force that he knew was critical for breaking through the German lines. In a moment that has become an unforgettable part of the Patton legend, he summoned the Third Army's head chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to his headquarters. "Chaplain," Patton said with dead seriousness, "I want you to publish a prayer for good weather. I'm tired of these generals who believe only in their maps and their intelligence and their fancy calculations. I believe in God and guts." The chaplain, a Catholic priest, was taken aback. He gently pointed out to the general that it was not customary to pray for such specific, tactical things. Patton was not deterred. "I am a strong believer in prayer," he insisted. "There are 3 ways that men get what they want: by planning, by working, and by praying. I have done my part of the planning and the work. I want you to do the praying." Colonel O'Neill, knowing better than to argue with the determined General Patton, dutifully composed a simple, eloquent prayer on a small card. It began, "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee of Thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle." Patton was so pleased with the result that he ordered his staff to have 250,000 copies printed immediately and distributed to every single man in the Third Army, along with his personal Christmas greeting. On December 23rd, shortly after the prayer cards had been distributed throughout the Third Army, the impossible happened. The weather, which had been stubbornly soaked in with thick fog and snow for over a week, miraculously broke. The thick cloud cover dissipated, the fog lifted, and the sun appeared in a brilliant, cold blue sky. The pilots of the 9th Air Force, who had been grounded and pacing their airfields with frustration, scrambled to their planes. Within hours, the skies over the Ardennes were filled with hundreds of American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. They descended upon the exposed German armored columns, which had been advancing with impunity, and began to wreak absolute havoc, turning the snowy landscape into a vast graveyard of burning German tanks and trucks. Patton, ecstatic, immediately summoned the chaplain to his headquarters. "Chaplain," he beamed, "you're a hell of a fine chaplain. You have stood up and delivered." He then, on the spot, pinned a Bronze Star medal on Colonel O'Neill's chest. Whether it was a moment of genuine divine intervention or a perfectly timed meteorological coincidence, the Patton weather had arrived, and the stage was now set for the final, bloody assault to save Bastogne. The bloody road, a mysterious end, and an unsettling legacy. Exactly 48 hours after General Patton had made his audacious promise in the grim bunker at Verdun, the Third Army launched its massive counterattack. This was not a simple relief mission up an open highway. It was a brutal, head-on assault into the heavily defended southern flank of the German Bulge. It was a collision with some of the most determined, battle-hardened, and elite units in the entire Wehrmacht, including elements of the formidable 5th Panzer Army. The fighting that ensued was a desperate, close-quarter struggle. The American soldiers of the Third Army, exhausted from their previous battle, frozen from the relentless cold, but motivated by Patton's indomitable will, fought with incredible tenacity and courage. The Germans, who had been completely stunned by the speed and ferocity of a major counterattack they believed to be a logistical impossibility, fought back with equal desperation. They knew that if Patton's forces managed to break through their flank and reach the besieged town of Bastogne, the momentum of their entire carefully planned offensive would be lost. The spearhead of Patton's attack was his best and most experienced unit, the 4th Armored Division. For 4 brutal, relentless days, they clawed their way forward, measuring their advance in bloody yards, not miles. They had to fight their way through a series of heavily defended German-held villages, each one turned into a miniature fortress of machine gun nests, mortar pits, and well-hidden 88mm anti-tank guns. The American infantrymen moved through waist-deep snow, while their Sherman tanks struggled for traction on the icy roads, making them vulnerable to ambush by German Panzerfaust teams lurking in the woods. The casualties on both sides were appalling. Meanwhile, inside the surrounded town of Bastogne, the situation for the besieged 101st Airborne Division was becoming critical. After nearly a week of constant German attacks and artillery bombardments, they were running dangerously low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The German commander had sent a formal demand for their surrender, to which the 101st acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had issued his now legendary defiant one-word reply, "Nuts!" It was a magnificent gesture of defiance that became a symbol of American resolve, but defiance alone could not hold the town forever. The paratroopers were freezing, starving, and fighting for their very lives, with their last hopes pinned on the persistent rumors that Patton and the Third Army were fighting their way towards them. By the afternoon of December 26th, the 4th Armored Division was on the very outskirts of the town. A small combined arms task force, led by the brilliant and aggressive Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams in his Sherman tank, famously named Thunderbolt, launched a final, desperate assault. They smashed through the last German defensive line and, in the fading light of the late afternoon, rolled into the grateful American perimeter at Bastogne. One of the first men to greet them was a weary, frozen paratrooper, huddled in a foxhole, who reportedly looked up at the tank and said, "Glad to see you." The week-long siege of Bastogne was broken. The link-up was far more than just a tactical victory. It was a massive psychological blow to the German army and a monumental boost to Allied morale. The news flashed across the world via radio and newspapers. Patton had done the impossible. He had saved Bastogne. For any other general in the Allied army, relieving the besieged town of Bastogne would have been the culmination of the battle, a moment to celebrate a hard-won victory, to rest, refit, and regroup. For George Patton, it was just the beginning. The very moment he received confirmation that the siege had been broken, his mind was already leaping ahead to the next phase of the battle. He was not interested in simply pushing the Germans back out of the bulge they had created. His immediate reaction was to get on the phone and argue furiously with his superiors, particularly his more cautious boss, Omar Bradley. Patton demanded that they allow him to continue his attack relentlessly to the north, all the way to the base of the salient, to trap the entire German force of nearly 500,000 men and annihilate them. Bradley, preferring a slower, more methodical, and less risky reduction of the pocket, vetoed the audacious plan. But the moment revealed the absolute, unchanging essence of Patton's military genius. For him, defense was an obscenity. The only purpose of fighting was to attack, to advance, and to utterly destroy the enemy's will and capacity to fight. The relief of Bastogne was the definitive turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. Although brutal fighting continued for another month, the German offensive had been decisively stopped in its tracks. Hitler's last great gamble in the West had failed, and the cost to the Wehrmacht was catastrophic. He had lost the very last of his strategic reserves, hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and armored vehicles, and over 100,000 of his best and most experienced soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The Western Front was broken, and the road to Berlin was now wide open. Patton's reputation was validated forever as America's greatest battlefield commander. He had performed a feat of generalship that astounded his allies and his enemies alike. The German commanders, in particular, were generous in their praise of him after the war. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall German commander in the West, stated simply and without reservation, "He is your best." The respect, in a warrior sense, was mutual. Patton, in contrast to his fiery public speeches, privately admitted in his diary that the German soldiers fought with incredible skill and bravery. "The Germans are colder and hungrier than we are," he wrote during the heat of the battle, "but they fight better." It was his job, he believed, to will his men to be even better, and he had succeeded beyond all measure. After the Bulge, Patton's Third Army continued its relentless drive, smashing through Germany's vaunted Siegfried Line, crossing the Rhine River, and plunging deep into the heart of the dying Third Reich. But as the war in Europe drew to its inevitable close, Patton, the lifelong warrior, found himself increasingly and dangerously out of step with the new political realities of the post-war world. Appointed as the military governor of occupied Bavaria, he chafed at his new administrative duties. He openly mocked the Allied policy of denazification, comparing the Nazi Party to the Democrats and Republicans back home, and arguing that removing all former party members from positions of authority was crippling Germany's ability to rebuild. On December 9, 1945, just 12 days before he was scheduled to return home to the United States for good, General Patton went on a hunting trip near Mannheim, Germany. On the way, his 1938 Cadillac limousine, traveling at a relatively low speed of about 15 miles per hour, collided with an American Army truck that had unexpectedly turned in front of it. The other passengers in the car were barely injured, but Patton, sitting alone in the spacious back seat, was thrown forward and his head hit a metal partition. He suffered a catastrophic compression fracture and dislocation of his cervical vertebrae. The injury to his spinal cord left him paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered in a hospital for 12 agonizing days before dying of a pulmonary embolism on December 21st.